The first day I ever worked in cricket was with the St Lucia Stars, and I walked into the ground and I saw Raheem Cornwall batting. My overriding memory of all that was a wide ball he faced from a spinner, where he lost his shape and could barely reach it, and he still hit the ball over cover for 6, and it was the long boundary.
This is the last knot. My dad told me to say this.
I have seen a lot of big shots over cover before. Usually the batter has great position or is using the pace of a quick. Cornwall just hit it because he has incredible power. There are a lot of jokes about his fitness, but there's no doubt that he's an incredible athlete. Just a different kind to what we usually see in cricket. Recently, Cricket South Africa has been on a huge kick to get their players fitter, to become the sort of athletes that they're looking for. And there is nothing wrong with the general thought behind that. This is now a billion-dollar professional game, and the players are paid to look after themselves, and they're also given help with fitness plans and dietitians and everything else. The tricky bit with cricket is that there's a lot of skills involved also. You need to be fitter to use your skills, but someone with less fitness and more skills might still beat you. But South Africa are being very upfront. They want their players to be incredibly fit. And the last person to fall foul of this is their captain, or I suppose at the moment their former captain, Dane van Niekerk. She was in a time trial over 2 kilometers, and she was 18 seconds slower than what was required. And if your first thought is, well, all athletes should be able to do this to be paid, there's a couple more details on this particular story that are interesting. This was actually her personal best time. And that's not a bad effort from a player who was just about to turn 30 and had already represented South Africa 194 times. Also, she had just lost 10 kilograms, and part of the reason she put on that weight was because she had been recovering from a broken ankle. And South Africa obviously knew all this, but they still weren't budging. And it means that the South African women's team will now not have its leader, and someone since the start of 2020 has the 14th most runs in the women's T20 and has also taken the 39th most wickets. Her numbers are not quite elite in either, but you put those together as a package and she's obviously a well above average player, and that's before you even factor in her captaincy and leadership skills. This is one hell of a player to drop when she's lost 10 kilograms, recorded her fastest 2K time trial ever, and is coming back from a broken ankle. And that also means that 2 of South Africa's most obvious batters will not be at their home World Cup, because Lizelle Lee retired from South Africa cricket after she was dropped for also failing fitness tests. For her, she actually passed her 2K trial, but she wasn't under the weight that she was told to clear. That meant a player who had scored the most runs in ODIs in 2021 with an average of 90 was no longer available for the national side. These are quite clearly 2 of the best players that South Africa has ever produced, now or ever. And because of these new fitness regulations, it means neither of them are playing. And there's lots of interesting issues here. One is body shaming, which is something that Lizelle Lee has talked about. And it's something that sport has done for many years. I'm sure I have done it many times in my work, even when trying to be careful. And probably on times when I should have been. It's a really tough thing to discuss. I mean, sometimes it can be quite clear the sort of players who need to work on their fitness more. But pointing this out is a little bit tricky. The other issue is slightly more women specific. And we did actually see this play out in the last 20 to 30 years of the men as well. The move from amateur to professional takes a long time. Lizelle Lee and Dane van Niekerk actually started as amateurs. They had jobs, they did other things, and they fit cricket around their normal life. But now they are top-tier professionals. Not everyone changes a lifetime of habits with a snap of the finger. And when it comes to women's cricket, athleticism and fitness tests were never even a major part of it until very, very recently. And we've seen this play out with other women's teams as well. England became professional in 2012, and in 2016 they lost a World Cup semi-final, and their coach, Mark Robertson, was very upset with their fitness. And the thing is that in 2023, the women's game is already far fitter and athletic than it has been the generation before. But with a few key exceptions, the level of athleticism is still not that high. And it will change, because that's what money does. But obviously not straight away. But this is not just a woman's issue, because we also have Sisanda Magala. If you weren't following the South Africa-England one days recently, you might have missed the fact that Magala made a comeback. He destroyed England in the middle overs and led to a pretty unlikely win. But before that, he had failed another 2-kilometer test. And so he was on the outer as well. Since then, he has lost a little bit of weight and also passed the time required. So it's quite clear that Cricket South Africa are putting a line in the sand. They want their players fitter. No one actually argues that professional athletes shouldn't be fitter, but it is worth pointing out that Lizelle Lee, Dane van Niekerk, and Sisanda Magala are 3 completely different kinds of cricketers. And because of that, 3 very different kinds of athletes. And so having a one-size-fits-all, pun intended, fitness test doesn't make any sense. If you just focus a little bit on T20 cricket, it is clearly becoming, I think, more and more like baseball. And that is worth noting, because baseball athletic types vary massively depending on which position you play in the team. Outfielders are the ones that we would traditionally call the most athletic. They can run and cover ground and jump if needed. There are some infielders, like shortstops, who are explosive over their first few steps. Catchers are usually a little bit thicker as they don't have to move much. Base fielders and designated hitters can be even thicker again. And of course, then you have the pitchers, who are usually full of lanky limbs. Cricket isn't quite there yet, but there is already some power hitters coming through, and then some others whose main strength is manipulating the field and running hard. But even if you look traditionally, fast bowlers and spinners are massively different kinds of athletes. We haven't even mentioned wicket keepers as well. And of course, people then specialise in different parts of the field. If you focus on T20 one-day cricket, you know that you need a minimum of 6 outfielders in your side. 5 is enough, but not if one of them is a bowler. And most teams think they can carry 2 fielders who are in the ring who don't possess any great ground covering skill. These players usually go behind the wickets, where you rarely have to chase the ball in white ball cricket. And you could certainly argue now that in T20 cricket, the most important fielders, probably by some distance, are the boundary riders. And so now what happens is the best fielders just stay there. Your absolute guns at the end of the game run from long on to long on after every single over. In fact, they travel a lot more than any other fielders on the ground. And even the teams who have more players who can be boundary riders, they usually still just use their best players in the most important positions and then run them a little bit more ragged. But having more players who can field on the boundary allows a little bit more flexibility, which means your players have a little bit more energy for their main skill, be it batting or bowling or both. There is something else that's worth pointing out here. In the outfield specifically, you do have to cover a lot of ground, so you do have to be someone who's very quick. But being a good fielder and being very quick over 30 or 40 meters are not always linked. There are actually some very good slower moving outfielders in cricket. And the reason they're good is they read the game a little bit earlier. So they get into position. So instead of having to beat someone with pace, they beat them with anticipation. Then with the ball in their hand, they make the right choices. Then they have good hands, so they don't fumble as much as other players. When a choice is needed, they make the right one. And quite often they might still have a cannon arm. Even inside the circle, we quite often look at the players who can jump around and stop things. We don't focus on the players who never fumble and hit the stumps a lot more. And there is absolutely no doubt that fielders are usually better if they can move explosively, and that is usually easier to do when you're fit, especially as you get tired. But of course, cricket is a burst sport. No one does a 2K run in cricket. And so that is something that Magala has noted before. And in fact, we do have a bit of research on how men move in a T20 game. During the 2017-18 Big Bash season, 12 games were studied to look at what players actually did during the match. And there is a lot of great information from this report as they used GPS data of players, as they gave us an updated understanding of actually what is happening out on the field. You can see that batters don't do many kilometers when batting, but they make up for that in the field. Fast bowlers usually do more work in the field because of their run-ups, which also tells you just how much extra work a seam bowling all-rounder actually does. And as you can see, there's quite a few kilometers covered there. But the players are not always sprinting, or even running that much. And around 70% of the time, cricketers are walking. And if you've ever played a cricket game with a fitness tracker on, you'll know this when you have a look at how many calories you burn at the end. And for this study, it actually shows you just how little cricketers have to sprint. That doesn't mean they don't have to be fit. It doesn't mean that being very quick doesn't help. It's just not something that happens as often as we probably previously thought. It's actually hard to sprint when running between the wickets because you're starting from a standing start and you have to slow down, turn, and come back again. And even in the field, there aren't that many occasions when you have to sprint around a boundary. Mostly cricket is 5 to 10 quick steps and then walking. But of course, cricket boards are still going to want to test their players and see how fit they are. Currently in cricket, they use the yo-yo test or beep test, skin folds, and of course, quite a few teams use a 2K run. They're obviously not the best way to check if you're fit for cricket. Nothing really tests you if you're fit for cricket except for playing cricket. And you might be assuming, well, there's no way to test a player in game. Except there has been, and for a very long time. Catapult is a system that was invented for Australian sport in the 1980s, and it came to cricket shortly after that, so we could get real-time information of the players out in the field. You'll probably have seen players wearing them. They look a little bit like a sports bra with a smart device put into the back of them. It's not just cricketers use this is used around the world, and allows us to check vital statistics of meters covered, but also heart rates and everything else of the players on field. It's a health device and a GPS tracker. England have used information like this to check if their players were playing and training with the kind of intensity that they were looking for. And I'm sure that other teams have used it to see if a player is hiding an injury or just struggling for their overall fitness. And England is also worth bringing up as well because they have a personal fitness plan for each player. Because cricketers vary so much. They look at the player's natural state and they work from that. This is a far better system than just a 2K trial. So there are better ways out there. The other thing that's interesting about fitness tests is that there is already a bias against players who look overweight. There's absolutely no doubt that they are discriminated against when it comes to selection. Of recent times, we've seen Azam Khan, Prithvi Shaw, Sarfaraz Khan, and Samet Patel to play regularly, even though their numbers suggest they are incredible. So the bias already exists. And there is absolutely no doubt that players who don't cover the ground particularly quickly do actually cause issues in cricket. You are not just running for yourself, you're running for the player at the other end. In fact, if we go back to St. Lucia and Cornwall, I was there when we had to make a decision about whether he opened the batting or not. The problem was his partner was going to be David Warner. So you have one player who hits and stands still, and the other one who gets into his innings by stealing runs. And that is before we talk about fielding. If you already have one bowler who can't field and an older player who doesn't move as well, bringing in another fielder who can't cover the ground is going to be a problem for you. You can't hide everyone. There are drawbacks to this, but I would say that's probably less the reason. And I would say mostly it's just that people think the players should be fitter, and that because they aren't, they must be lazy. And that isn't a cricket thing, of course. That's a societal issue. And the argument that pro athletes should be fitter, of course, makes sense. And there are plenty of players, even those who look fit, who certainly could do a lot more work on their body, which would probably overall help their game. The fitter you are, the less tired you get, the more correct decisions you can make. There's no doubt that cricketers should try and get as fit as they can. And what strength and fitness people in cricket would say is that even though a 2K run is not an ideal test, or certainly not the perfect one, it does allow them to see base levels of fitness for certain players. And if you're not as fit, then you will make more mistakes, and obviously your team will struggle. The thing is that most of the players who are seen as not as fit usually have remarkable numbers. That's how we even know of them already. If they were mediocre players, they wouldn't have even made it through the system. So why isn't it showing in their performance numbers as much? It's not to say that they're not sometimes making mistakes because they're tired more than a normal player. Perhaps that suggests they were even better than the other player to begin with. Because even when they're tired, they're still just incredible players. And if fitness matters as much as Cricket South Africa think it does, well, that must mean that those players who've made it successfully without it are just incredible. And I also think that ultimately the truth is you are paid to be good at cricket, not to be fit. And if your fitness means that you're bringing the team down through obvious runs being turned down or having to be hit in the field, then this is an issue. But that, again, is a cricket issue, not a fitness issue. And the truth is, any weakness in your game means you might get dropped because you can lose your spot for personality, work ethic, professionalism, skill, form, or even pitch conditions. Even a player who is very fit but can't field is still an issue for a team. Pretty much all batters who can't bat at all have a similar issue, as do the rarer cases of batters who can't field. The less parts of your games that are a plus or an average, the worse it is. It just seems that being non-fit seems to stand out more. And maybe even more so now because cricketers are getting so much more athletic than they were in previous generations. And it's also worth saying that the 2K time trials that South Africa are requiring are not exactly hardcore. There are probably some incredible athletes in the world like, I don't know, shot putters or weightlifters who would struggle to cover them. But the vast majority of professional athletes could easily slip under them. And if it is your job, you will fight hard for it. And Magala did. And so did Van Niekerk. She gave Cricket South Africa her best ever time and she still fell short. It's clear that while she is definitely a cricketer, she is also definitely not a runner. And she's certainly not the only one. It would be hard to say that Chris Gayle was not a great athlete. He was one of the best hitters of a cricket ball we've ever seen. And we've also seen him topless over the years. Many, many times. Almost as many times as he's hit sixes. He looks incredibly fit. Yet, Chris Gayle is as slow as hell. In fact, when he was asked to do a beep test for KKR, he allegedly walked off the field and said, "I'm not going to do this." He allegedly walked off the field and said, "If you don't want me, don't pick me." And if you watch Gayle, you can see how much he struggles to move sideways at all. And his running between wickets was statuesque. And there were many issues when it came to why Gayle couldn't run or bend or move. Most of them were probably hamstring related. Even early in his career, every quick single seemed to tweak something. But clearly at times he was a liability for T20 teams when he was not hitting sixes. And there were times when franchises didn't want Gayle, and part of that was because he couldn't run between the wicket and he couldn't field. But there were many other times when they took that punt because of, all the sixes. The interesting thing about a player like Van Niekerk is that there really are a bunch of ways as a cricketer that at times in his career, Gayle was incredibly one-dimensional. Van Niekerk is not. If you think about it, there are a bunch of ways any cricketer can help their team. And she nearly does all of them. She can bat and bowl well enough to be a plus for her team. She's not only a good tactician, but also just a genuinely good leader. And it's rare that captains have the ability to do both. In almost every element of the game, she's an above average international player. But she can't run, despite quite literally her best effort. That is a negative, but maybe not enough to actually drag her team down. Cricket has through history tended to pick on skill over fitness, even as the game has become more athletic at times. But South Africa are taking a stand in the other direction, and we've certainly seen other teams try this as well. And we know that they're serious because they are willing to go to a home World Cup without their captain. And the weird thing is, if they are right, the results won't come now, but in the future when all the other cricketers come through, we'll just have to be fitter or we'll never see them. But the real question would be whether they will be a worse team overall if they routinely don't pick players with higher skill levels. And I'm not sure there's actually a great way of judging that. And in this video, we have used the word athlete and fit and ground covering and all sorts of things. And like most people who look at sport, we think of athleticism as someone who could sprint very fast or jump very high. We don't look at other things like a quick first step or change in direction speed. On the Thinking Basketball podcast recently, they talked about different kinds of athleticism. And remember that is a sport way more obsessed by athleticism than cricket has ever been. And you can see by this visual that they were talking about athleticism in basketball in a completely different way than just how high you can jump or how fast you can run. Great cricketers need all of those things, and we don't think about them as athleticism, but of course they are a form of it, just not the most popular form. And all of this brings us back to Ruckin Cornwall. In cricket, he has been mocked for his lack of athleticism, even though he is certainly good enough to make contributions with bat and ball, and also has great hands when he fields in the slips. And while we don't think of him as a great athlete, and that is because we don't really measure or value the great athleticism that he clearly has. Cornwall is clearly not built like a normal cricketer. He's far taller and stronger than them for a start. This helps in his batting and his bowling. So he's clearly an incredible athlete, just not one that is very good at covering ground in the field. But don't let me just use cricket for this. How about the fact that in his mid-20s, he was asked to trial with the San Francisco 49ers in the NFL? I'm not sure they've gone for too many other cricketers in their time. This is a kind of cricket athlete. He just has more strength than most. Incredible hand-eye coordination and reflexes, plus incredible dexterity in his fingers and wrists. It's true that he might struggle on a 2K run, but it would probably take him fewer hits to cover that amount of distance with the bat in his hand. One of the reasons that cricket is so magnificent is that there are many different kinds of athletes that can be good at it.